Hello everyone, and welcome back to Snowbound Screams. Tonight, we travel into the sterile corridors of American hospitals places where healing meets horror. And what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these emergency rooms, intensive care units, and long-term care facilities are accounts drawn from witness reports, hospital records, and archived testimonies, each one verified, documented, and retold in their own words. These are the experiences of medical professionals who encountered phenomena that defy medical explanation. The places where science meets the inexplicable. Now, let us begin. With our first story, in the winter of 2017, registered nurse Sarah Mitchell began her third consecutive night shift at St. Jude's Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland. The 12-hour shifts had become routine after 5 years on the telemetry unit, where she monitored patients with heart conditions through a network of screens and alarms. That particular Tuesday evening, the hospital was operating at 75% capacity, with winter admissions beginning to fill the empty beds. Sarah had just completed her rounds at 11:47 p.m. when she settled into the nursing station to review patient charts and document her assessments. The telemetry unit occupied the 8th floor, a long corridor with patient rooms on one side and a bank of windows overlooking the city on the other. The fluorescent lights cast a pale green glow on the linoleum floors, and the only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the occasional distant announcement over the hospital's PA system. Sarah had grown accustomed to these nocturnal rhythms, finding comfort in the predictable patterns of medical care, even during the graveyard shift. At 2:13 a.m., she noticed something unusual on her monitor screen. Room 814, which should have been empty, was showing a regular heartbeat pattern at 72 beats per minute. Sarah checked the patient assignment board again, confirming that room 814 had been vacant since Mrs. Henderson's discharge that morning. The telemetry leads in that room should have been disconnected, yet a perfect sinus rhythm continued to register on her screen. She called the telemetry technician in the basement monitoring room, who confirmed he was seeing the same reading and had already tried to reset the system without success. At 2:19 a.m., Sarah walked down the quiet corridor to investigate, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The door to room 814 stood slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it during her earlier rounds. The room was dark except for the ambient light from the hallway, and Sarah could see the empty bed with the telemetry cables coiled neatly on the pillow. As she stepped inside to check the equipment, she felt a sudden drop in temperature, so distinct that she could see her breath in the air. The cardiac monitor at the foot of the bed, which should have been powered down, suddenly illuminated, displaying the same 72-beat rhythm she had seen at the nursing station. Sarah reached for the light switch, but before her fingers made contact, she heard a soft whisper from the corner of the room, a woman's voice saying, "He's coming for me now." When she finally managed to turn on the lights, the room was empty, the monitor dark, and the temperature had returned to normal. The incident report filed the next morning, case 2017-814-TLE, noted equipment malfunction as the official explanation, though Sarah's written statement included the temperature change and whispered voice. The hospital's biomedical engineering department found no technical explanation for the telemetry reading from an empty room. What the report did not include was the discovery the following day Mrs. Henderson, the former patient in room 814, had passed away at home at approximately 2:20 a.m. that same night, her husband having called 911 when he found her unresponsive. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia. Sarah Mitchell requested a transfer to the maternity ward 2 weeks later, telling her supervisor only that she needed a change of scenery. The telemetry equipment in room 814 was replaced, though similar unexplained readings would continue to appear on 3 separate occasions over the next 2 years. In the autumn of 2014, David Chen began his position as a morgue attendant at County General Hospital in Rochester, New York. The job was a temporary arrangement while he completed his prerequisites for medical school, and the night shift in the hospital basement paid better than most student positions. The morgue was a sterile environment of stainless steel tables, refrigerated compartments, and clinical lighting, with a distinct antiseptic smell that never quite faded. David had worked there for 3 months without incident, developing a routine for processing deceased patients and maintaining the detailed records required by the hospital and the county coroner's office. The incident occurred on November 5th, 2014, at approximately 3:22 a.m. David was completing the documentation for a 78-year-old male who had been pronounced dead at 11:45 p.m. the previous evening. The morgue was quiet except for the humming of the refrigeration units and the occasional sound of the ventilation system cycling on. As David finalized the paperwork, he heard what sounded like a soft tapping coming from one of the refrigerated compartments, compartment 4, which contained the body he had just been documenting. He paused, listening carefully, and heard it again. 3 distinct taps, as if someone were knocking from inside the sealed drawer. David checked the monitoring system, which showed normal temperature and oxygen levels in all compartments. He rationalized that the sound might be related to the normal process of rigor mortis or gaseous release, though he had never heard anything quite like it in his 3 months of employment. As he approached compartment 4, the tapping stopped, replaced by what sounded like a faint scratching noise. David placed his hand on the exterior of the compartment and felt a distinct vibration, as if something were moving inside. At 3:28 a.m., he called his supervisor, who advised him to document the unusual occurrence and continue with his duties, noting that strange sounds are not uncommon in morgue settings due to natural processes. Despite this reassurance, David felt increasingly uneasy as he continued his work. At 3:47 a.m., he heard a new sound, the distinct click of the latch mechanism on compartment 4, as if someone were attempting to open it from the inside. This was impossible, as the compartments could only be opened from the outside using the release handle, which required significant force to operate. David approached the compartment again and noticed that the temperature gauge was reading slightly higher than normal, though still within acceptable parameters. As he watched, the handle on compartment 4 began to move slowly, as if being turned by an invisible hand. David retreated to the office and locked the door, calling security to report a potential breach. Security arrived at 4:02 a.m. and conducted a thorough search of the morgue, finding no signs of forced entry or any explanation for the sounds David had reported. When they opened compartment 4 together, the body inside remained exactly as David had left it, with no indication of disturbance. The security incident report, Case DRS M14-1105 SEC, noted unexplained sounds and possible equipment malfunction as the official explanation. What the report did not mention was that the body in compartment 4 belonged to a man who had been pronounced dead after being found unresponsive in his locked apartment. Neighbors had reported hearing knocking sounds from his apartment throughout the evening before authorities broke down the door. David Chen completed his shift, but never returned to the morgue, changing his career path from medicine to biomedical engineering. The compartment was temporarily taken out of service for maintenance, though technicians found no mechanical explanation for the events of that night. In the spring of 2019, respiratory therapist Maria Rodriguez was working the night shift in the pediatric intensive care unit at Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. With 12 years of experience treating critically ill children, Maria had developed a professional detachment that allowed her to focus on the technical aspects of care without becoming overwhelmed by the emotional weight of her work. That particular evening in May, the PIQ was unusually quiet, with only 5 of the 12 beds occupied. The unit's soft lighting and muted colors created an atmosphere designed to be calming for young patients, though at night, with families gone and most children sleeping, the unit felt almost eerily peaceful. The first unusual occurrence happened at 1:17 a.m. as Maria was adjusting ventilator settings for a 3-year-old asthma patient. She heard what sounded like a child's laughter coming from the hallway, though she knew all the children in the unit were either sedated or too ill to be playing. She stepped out of the room to investigate, but found the corridor empty. The nursing station staff focused on their documentation. The charge nurse, hearing the same sound, attributed it to audio from a nearby waiting room television, though Maria noted that all waiting areas on the pediatric floor were closed overnight. Returning to her patient's room, Maria resumed her work, chalking the sound up to fatigue or an auditory illusion common among night shift workers. At 2:43 a.m., while performing routine respiratory assessments on a 7-year-old cystic fibrosis patient, Maria noticed something peculiar, a small red ball sitting in the corner of the room near the window. She was certain it had not been there during her earlier rounds, as she always noted any potential hazards or objects that might interfere with medical equipment. The ball was old-fashioned, made of worn rubber with a faded star pattern, unlike any of the toys provided by the hospital's child life department. As she approached to remove it, the ball rolled slightly, as if moved by an unseen hand. Maria picked it up and placed it on the counter, intending to ask the day shift staff about its origin. The most disturbing event occurred at 3:29 a.m. Maria was documenting her treatments in the medication room when she heard a child's voice directly behind her say, "I can't breathe." She turned immediately to find no one there, though the voice had been so clear that she felt the breath on her neck. Simultaneously, every ventilator alarm on the unit began sounding, indicating critical issues with all 5 patients who required mechanical ventilation. The nursing staff rushed to respond, finding that each machine had been tampered with, pressure settings altered, tubing disconnected, or alarms silenced. Maria was the only respiratory therapist on duty that night, and she had been in the medication room when the changes occurred. The incident was reported to hospital administration at 4:15 a.m., with an immediate investigation launched into potential equipment tampering or sabotage. Security footage showed no unauthorized individuals entering the unit, and only staff members with proper clearance were visible on camera. The biomedical engineering department found no mechanical explanation for the simultaneous failure of 5 different ventilator models from 3 different manufacturers. The official incident report, case CHLA 190503 vent, cited unexplained equipment malfunction as the cause, though privately, several staff members expressed concern about more sinister possibilities. What the report did not include was the discovery that the pediatric ward had been expanded 20 years earlier, incorporating the space that had previously been the hospital's original children's ward from the 1950s. A ward that had closed after a respiratory illness outbreak resulted in the deaths of several young patients. Maria Rodriguez requested a permanent transfer to the adult pulmonary unit the following week, telling her supervisor only that she needed a change in her work environment. The red ball was never identified or claimed, and it disappeared from the counter where Maria had left it sometime before the day shift arrived. In the summer of 2016, Dr. Michael Reynolds was completing his emergency medicine residency at Mercy Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. The emergency department was perpetually busy, a chaotic environment of urgent medical needs, grieving families, and the constant pressure of life or death decisions. Dr. Reynolds had adapted well to this high-stress environment, developing a calm demeanor that served him well during the most challenging cases. That particular July night was especially taxing. with the emergency department at capacity and several critical patients awaiting treatment in the hallway due to a shortage of available rooms. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the frantic scene of medical professionals moving with practiced urgency through the crowded department. The unusual encounter began at 11:58 p.m., when paramedics brought in a man found unresponsive on a city bus. The patient, estimated to be in his late 60s, had no identification and was dressed in clothing that appeared to be from a previous decade. Dr. Reynolds began the initial assessment while the nursing staff attempted to establish IV access and connect cardiac monitoring. What struck Dr. Reynolds as odd was the patient's temperature. Despite the summer heat outside, the man's skin was cold to the touch. Almost unnaturally so. The cardiac monitor showed a bizarre rhythm, not quite a systole's, but not a recognizable, viable rhythm either. At 12:04 a.m., as Dr. Reynolds was preparing to intubate, the patient's eyes suddenly opened and he looked directly at the physician, saying clearly, "They're still waiting for me in room 233. The medical team was startled, as the patient had shown no signs of consciousness upon arrival. Dr. Reynolds completed the intubation while asking the nursing staff to check the hospital census for any patients in room 233. The response came back quickly. There was no room 233 in the current hospital configuration, as the emergency department and adjoining facilities had been renovated 5 years earlier, renumbering all patient rooms. Meanwhile, the John Doe patient's condition continued to deteriorate despite aggressive interventions. At 12:17 a.m., his cardiac monitor flatlined, and despite resuscitation efforts, he was pronounced dead at 12:29 a.m. The mystery deepened when the hospital's older staff members were consulted about room 233. A nurse who had worked at Mercy Hospital for over 30 years explained that room 233 had existed in the original hospital building, a room that had been used for terminal patients before the hospice wing was constructed. What she didn't mention in her official statement was that room 233 had gained a reputation among staff as being haunted by the spirit of a doctor who had died there in 1978 while caring for patients during a severe influenza outbreak. The John Doe patient was transported to the morgue, where standard procedures for unidentified deceased patients were initiated. The following morning, a strange discovery was made during the routine inventory of the emergency department's medication room. A doctor's bag from the 1970s was found on a shelf, containing medical instruments that matched the era of the John Doe patient's clothing. The bag had no identification, though it did contain a hospital ID card with the name Dr. James Sullivan and a photograph that bore a striking resemblance to the deceased patient. Hospital records confirmed that Dr. Sullivan had died at Mercy Hospital on July 12, 1978, while treating patients during the flu outbreak, exactly 38 years to the day before the John Doe patient had been brought in. The official incident report, Case Number MER 216720001, cited unidentified patient with possible delirium as the explanation for the strange comment about room 233, making no mention of the doctor's bag or the coincidence of the date. Dr. Reynolds completed his residency without further unusual encounters, though he often wondered about the man who had spoken of a room that no longer existed. Dr. Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the encounter. In the weeks that followed, he found himself researching the history of Mercy Hospital, particularly the influenza outbreak of 1978. He discovered that Dr. James Sullivan had been one of several physicians who had succumbed to the virus while continuing to treat patients despite his own illness. The more he learned, the more he became convinced that what he had experienced that night was not merely a coincidence or a case of mistaken identity. Other staff members who had been present that night began to share their own unusual observations. The nurse who had attempted to establish IV access mentioned that the patient's veins had seemed unusually difficult to locate, almost as if they weren't fully there. The respiratory therapist who had assisted with the intubation noted that the patient's mouth had been strangely cold, like touching metal that had been left outside in winter. Even the paramedics who had brought the patient in recalled that the bus driver had mentioned finding the man already seated on the bus when he began his route, despite the bus having been cleaned and secured just hours earlier. As Dr. Reynolds continued his residency, he noticed other small anomalies that he couldn't quite explain. Sometimes, when working the night shift, he would catch a glimpse of someone in old-fashioned medical clothing standing in the corridors, only to disappear when he looked directly. On occasion, medical equipment would turn on or off by itself, though maintenance could never find a technical explanation. These incidents were subtle enough to be dismissed as fatigue or imagination, but they accumulated in Dr. Reynolds' mind like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. 6 months after the encounter with the John Doe patient, Dr. Reynolds was working in the newly constructed wing of the hospital when he noticed something unusual. On a wall that had recently been painted, there appeared a faint outline where a door might once have been, with the numbers 233 barely visible, as if written in pencil and then painted over. When he asked about it, the construction supervisor confirmed that they had discovered the outline of a doorway during renovations, which had been sealed decades earlier when the hospital layout was reconfigured. Dr. Reynolds never spoke publicly about his experience, knowing that it would likely be dismissed as stress-induced hallucination or an overactive imagination. But in the quiet moments between patients, when the emergency department was temporarily calm, he would sometimes find himself wondering about the boundaries between life and death, and about the connections that might persist beyond what a medical science could explain. The man who had spoken of room 233 remained an enigma, a temporary visitor who had left behind more questions than answers, and a doctor's bag that had materialized as mysteriously as it had disappeared, taking with it the possibility of a rational explanation for events that defied conventional understanding. In the winter of 2015, surgical technician James Park was working the night shift at Memorial Hospital in Portland, Oregon. The surgical floor was typically quiet after hours, with only emergency procedures scheduled after 8:01 p.m. James had been in this position for 3 years and appreciated the methodical nature of his work, preparing operating rooms, sterilizing instruments, and assisting surgeons during procedures. That particular December night, the hospital was experiencing a lull between holiday emergencies, with only 2 surgeries scheduled overnight. James had just finished preparing operating room 3 for an appendectomy scheduled at 2 a.m. when he noticed something unusual. The surgical floor was designed with operating rooms along one side of a long corridor and supply rooms and staff areas on the other. At 1:17 a.m., as James was returning from the sterile supply area, he saw movement in the otherwise darkened operating room 5, a room that had been closed for maintenance for the past week. The door was slightly ajar, though James was certain he had checked and secured all operating rooms before beginning his rounds. As he approached to close the door, he heard what sounded like muffled voices from inside, though the room should have been empty. James used his flashlight to peer inside and saw what appeared to be shadowy figures near the surgical table, though they vanished when he fully opened the door and turned on the lights. The operating room was empty, with all equipment covered and secured as expected. James noted the incident in his log and contacted security, who conducted a search of the floor but found no signs of unauthorized entry. At 1:42 a.m., while preparing instruments for the upcoming appendectomy, James heard the sound of a surgical instrument falling to the floor in operating room 5. When he went to investigate, he found a scalpel on the floor near the surgical table, a scalpel that matched the set he had just prepared for the appendectomy in operating room 3. He was certain all instruments had been accounted for just minutes earlier. And the sterile packaging of the scalpel set in OR3 was still intact. The most disturbing incident occurred at 2:38 a.m., after the appendectomy had begun in operating room 3. James was monitoring the surgical field when he noticed something peculiar in the reflection on the surgeon's visor. A figure standing behind him in the operating room, though he knew only the surgical team was present. When he turned to look directly, no one was there. But the surgeon suddenly paused, saying that he felt as if someone had touched his arm. At that exact moment, the lights in operating room 5 flickered on, visible through the small window in the door, though that room was not supposed to have power while under maintenance. The hospital's engineering department was contacted, and they confirmed that operating room 5 had been completely disconnected from the power grid during the maintenance period. Security footage showed no one entering or leaving the surgical floor except authorized staff members. The official incident report, Case number MH 2015-215-UOR5, cited possible electrical malfunction and equipment misplacement as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that operating room 5 had been the site of a surgical complication in 1989, resulting in the death of a prominent surgeon during a routine procedure. Hospital rumor held that the surgeon's spirit sometimes returned to the room that had been the site of his final work. James Park completed his shift without further incident, though he requested a transfer to the day shift the following week, citing a need to change his sleep schedule. The maintenance on operating room 5 was completed ahead of schedule, and the room was returned to service with a complete replacement of the electrical system. In the autumn of 2018, psychiatric nurse Amanda Foster was working the night shift at Riverview Behavioral Health Center in rural Ohio. The facility, originally built in the 1920s, had a long history of treating patients with severe mental illnesses, though it had been modernized significantly over the decades. Amanda had been working at Riverview for 2 years and had grown accustomed to the unusual sounds and behaviors that were part of the psychiatric environment. That particular November night, the unit was operating at near capacity with 27 patients, most of whom were sleeping or resting quietly in their rooms. The first strange occurrence happened at 12:43 a.m. during Amanda's rounds through the east wing of the facility. As she passed room 214, which belonged to a catatonic patient who hadn't spoken in 6 months, she clearly heard a woman's voice say, "Let me out." When she entered the room to check on the patient, she found him in the same unresponsive state as usual, sitting motionless in his chair and staring at the wall. Amanda noted the incident in her log, assuming it might have been an auditory hallucination caused by fatigue. At 1:19 a.m., while administering medication to another patient, she heard the same voice again, this time coming from the empty day room, though all patients were supposed to be in their rooms. The most disturbing event occurred at 2:27 a.m., when the fire alarm for the East Wing activated, indicating a potential emergency in that section of the facility. As Amanda followed protocol to evacuate patients, she noticed that the alarm was originating specifically from room 214, the room of the nonverbal catatonic patient. When she entered the room to assist him, she found him standing at the window, pointing toward the old abandoned administration building across the courtyard. The fire alarm suddenly stopped as mysteriously as it had started, though the control panel showed no evidence of a malfunction or manual activation. The following day, during a staff meeting, Amanda mentioned the strange occurrences in room 214. An older nurse who had worked at Riverview for over 30 years shared that room 214 had once been used for seclusion of particularly agitated patients in the 1950s and 1960s, before more modern treatment approaches were adopted. What she didn't mention in the official meeting was that a patient had died in that room in 1963 under questionable circumstances during an electroconvulsive therapy procedure. The patient, a woman who had been committed by her family against her will, had repeatedly asked to be released before her death. The official incident report, case RBH 2018-11-24, cited possible equipment malfunction as the explanation for the fire alarm activation, with no mention of the voices Amanda had heard. The catatonic patient in room 214 remained nonverbal, though in the following days he began repeatedly drawing pictures of a woman standing at a window, pointing toward the old administration building. Amanda Foster continued working at Riverview for another 6 months before transferring to a different facility, citing only a desire to be closer to home. Room 214 was taken out of service for renovations shortly after her departure, though no further unusual incidents were reported by the staff who took over her assignments. In the spring of 2020, laboratory technician Rachel Chen was working the graveyard shift at St. Mary's Medical Center in San Francisco, California. The hospital's laboratory was located in the basement, a windowless environment of automated analyzers, microscopes, and specimen storage areas. Rachel had been in this position for just over a year, having transferred from a smaller clinic to gain experience with a wider range of diagnostic tests. The night shift was typically quiet, with most test results coming from emergency department patients and a few inpatient specimens from the floors above. That particular April night, the laboratory was operating with minimal staffing due to budget cuts, leaving Rachel as the only technician on duty for most of her shift. The first unusual incident occurred at 1:32 a.m., while Rachel was processing blood samples from the emergency department. The automated hematology analyzer suddenly began running samples on its own, though no specimens had been loaded and the machine had been in standby mode. Rachel watched as the analyzer processed 20 samples, displaying results on the screen despite the absence of actual blood specimens. The results showed bizarre readings, impossible blood cell counts, and abnormal cell morphologies that didn't correspond to any known medical conditions. When Rachel tried to cancel the run, the machine displayed an error message in what appeared to be Latin: mortui viventis docent. Rachel documented the equipment malfunction and contacted the on-call biomedical engineer, who advised her to power down the machine and restart it. At 2:17 a.m., while she was preparing to do so, the laboratory's telephone rang. The caller ID showed the call was coming from the pathology department, which should have been unoccupied at that hour. When Rachel answered, she heard only static followed by a whispered voice that said, "You're looking in the wrong place." The call then disconnected. Rachel checked the call log, which showed no record of an incoming call, though she had clearly heard the phone ring and spoken with someone. The most disturbing event occurred at 3:48 a.m., when Rachel was reviewing the bizarre test results from the analyzer's mysterious run. As she examined the data, she noticed something peculiar. One of the impossible results included a patient name and medical record number that matched a former pathologist who had worked at the hospital 20 years earlier. Dr. Samuel Weiss had died in the laboratory in 2000 from a rare infectious disease he had contracted while studying unusual tissue samples. What Rachel didn't know was that Dr. Weiss had been working on a theory about certain diseases crossing the boundary between life and death when he became infected. The official incident report, case SM 2004-15 Lay B, who cited equipment malfunction and possible telephone system glitch as the explanation for the events. The hematology analyzer was serviced and found to have no technical explanation for the phantom run. The telephone system check revealed no evidence of the incoming call Rachel had reported. What the incident report did not mention was that the Latin phrase displayed on the analyzer, mortui viventes docent, translates to, "The dead teach the living." Rachel Chen completed her shift, but requested a transfer to the daytime chemistry department the following week, telling her supervisor only that she preferred working with a larger team. The hematology analyzer was replaced with a newer model, though similar unexplained runs would occur on 3 separate occasions over the next year. Always between 1 and 4 a.m. In the summer of 2017, physical therapist Kevin O'Malley was working the late shift at Lakeside Rehabilitation Hospital in Minnesota. The facility specialized in helping patients recover from serious injuries, strokes, and other debilitating conditions. Kevin had been at Lakeside for 3 years and often worked the evening shift, helping patients complete their therapy before bedtime. That particular July night, the hospital was operating at reduced capacity due to the summer holiday, with only the most critical patients remaining in residence. The rehabilitation gym, where Kevin spent most of his time, was a large space with mirrors along one wall, exercise equipment, and private treatment areas. The first unusual occurrence happened at 7:43 p.m. while Kevin was helping a stroke patient practice walking with assistance. As they passed the full-length mirrors on the wall, Kevin noticed what appeared to be a third person reflected in the glass, standing behind them, though no one else was in the gym. The figure was that of an elderly man in hospital scrubs, watching them with an expression Kevin couldn't quite identify. When Kevin turned to look directly, there was no one there, and his patient hadn't noticed anything unusual. Kevin attributed the sighting to fatigue or a trick of the light in the large mirrored space, though he felt unsettled by how clear the reflection had appeared. At 8:29 p.m., while Kevin was documenting his treatment sessions in the small office attached to the gym, he heard the distinct sound of a walker being moved across the floor. When he returned to the gym, he found that a walker had been moved from its storage position against the wall to the center of the room, though all patients were supposed to be in their rooms preparing for bed. The walker was of an older style that the hospital no longer used, with rubber wheels that left distinct tracks on the polished floor. Kevin noted the incident in his log and returned the walker to storage, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The most disturbing event occurred at 9:15 p.m. as Kevin was preparing to leave for the night. As he was shutting down the equipment in the gym, he heard what sounded like someone practicing with a parallel bar, the rhythmic sound of hands moving along the rails, followed by shuffling footsteps. When he investigated, he found the parallel bars vibrating slightly, as if recently used, though no one was in the gym. As he stood there listening, he heard a faint voice say, "One more step, you can do it," followed by the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. When Kevin examined the parallel bars more closely, he found fresh handprints on the rails, though they disappeared when he touched them, as if they had never been there. The official incident report, case LRH 2001-700712-PT, cited possible equipment vibration and auditory illusion as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that the rehabilitation gym had been built on the site of the hospital's original physical therapy department from the 1960s. An elderly physical therapist had suffered a fatal heart attack in that very location in 1972 while helping a patient practice with the parallel bars. Kevin O'Malley completed his shift but requested a transfer to the outpatient clinic the following week, citing a need for more regular hours. The old walker that had mysteriously appeared in the gym was never identified, and the hospital's equipment inventory showed no record of such a device being in service at Lakeside for over a decade. In the winter of 2016, radiology technician Jennifer Martinez was working the night shift at Northside Medical Center in Denver, Colorado. The radiology department was located in the hospital's lower level, a maze of lead-lined rooms, dark rooms, and imaging equipment. Jennifer had been in this position for 2 years and appreciated the technical precision required for her work, positioning patients correctly, adjusting imaging parameters, and ensuring diagnostic quality while minimizing radiation exposure. That particular January night, the department was handling only emergency cases, with scheduled imaging procedures postponed until morning. The first unusual incident occurred at 11:47 p.m., while Jennifer was preparing a CT scanner for a trauma patient from the emergency department. As she entered the scanning room, she noticed what appeared to be footprints on the floor, leading from the door to the scanner console and back again. The footprints were made of a dark substance that looked like blood, though when Jennifer examined them more closely, they seemed to fade before her eyes. She checked the scanner's previous usage log and found that it hadn't been used for over 2 hours, and the cleaning staff had already completed their rounds. Jennifer documented the finding and proceeded with preparing the scanner, though she felt increasingly uneasy in the otherwise quiet department. At 1:23 a.m., while Jennifer was developing X-ray images in the darkroom, the door suddenly locked itself, though she was certain she hadn't engaged the security mechanism. When she tried to exit, she found that the door wouldn't open, despite her repeated attempts to disengage the lock. As she stood there in the red-lit darkness, she heard what sounded like breathing behind her, though she knew she was alone in the small room. After approximately 3 minutes, the lock suddenly disengaged on its own, and Jennifer was able to exit, finding the corridor empty and quiet. She reported the malfunction to the maintenance department, though they found no explanation for the door's mysterious behavior. The most disturbing event occurred at 2:58 a.m., while Jennifer was conducting a CT scan on a patient with head trauma. As the images appeared on her monitor, she noticed something impossible superimposed over the patient's brain images, were what appeared to be older CT images from a different patient, showing severe head trauma that didn't match the current case. When she tried to clear the screen, the images remained, growing more distinct until Jennifer could clearly see that they were labeled with a date from 1998 and a patient name she didn't recognize. As she stared at the mysterious images, she heard a voice whisper from the scanner's speaker system. It wasn't an accident, followed by the sound of the machine powering down on its own. The official incident report, case nor NMC 2001-118 RAD, cited possible equipment malfunction and system cross-contamination as the explanation for the events. The CT scanner was serviced and found to have no technical explanation for the superimposed images. The maintenance department found no mechanical explanation for the darkroom door's mysterious locking. What the incident report did not mention was that hospital records from 1998 showed a patient with the name on the mysterious images had died in the radiology department from head trauma that was later determined to be non-accidental, the victim of an assault by a hospital employee who was never identified. Jennifer Martinez completed her shift but requested a transfer to the outpatient imaging center the following week, telling her supervisor only that she wanted to work more regular daytime hours. The CT scanner was replaced with a newer model, though similar unexplained image artifacts would appear on 2 separate occasions over the next year. In the autumn of 2019, hospital administrator David Thompson was working late at Riverside General Hospital in Savannah, Georgia. As the chief operating officer, David often found himself handling administrative tasks after normal business hours, especially when preparing for accreditation visits or board meetings. That particular November evening, he was reviewing budget reports in his office on the 3rd floor of the administrative wing, which was nearly deserted after 6 p.m. The administrative wing was the oldest part of the hospital, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a distinctive smell of old paper and furniture polish. The first unusual occurrence happened at 7:32 p.m., when David heard what sounded like a hospital paging system being tested, though the public address system in the administrative wing had been disconnected for years. The announcement was muffled, but clear enough for David to make out the words, "Dr. Reynolds to the morgue, stat." David knew there was no Dr. Reynolds on the current hospital staff, and the morgue was located in a different building entirely. When he went to investigate, he found the corridor empty and quiet, with no explanation for the announcement he had just heard. At 8:47 p.m., while David was making copies of budget documents in the small copy room, the light suddenly flickered and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. And as he fumbled for his phone to use its flashlight, he heard what sounded like a gurney being wheeled down the hallway. Though the administrative wing had no patient care areas and no reason for medical equipment to be there. When the lights came back on approximately 30 seconds later, David found that a stack of papers on his desk had been rearranged into a neat pile, though he was certain he had left them scattered. More disturbingly, one document a page from the hospital's historical records was placed on top of the pile, open to a section about the hospital's early years in the 1920s. The most disturbing event occurred at 9:53 p.m., as David was preparing to leave for the night. As he passed the old conference room at the end of the corridor, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Though he was certain he had checked and locked all offices before settling into work. When he approached to close the door, he heard what sounded like multiple people talking inside, though the room should have been empty. David used his phone to record the sounds, which he later described as resembling a medical conference or teaching session, with terms like prognosis and mortality rate clearly audible. When he pushed the door open, the room was empty, though the chairs around the conference table appeared to have been recently moved, as if a meeting had just ended. The official incident report, Case RGH 21912 Admin, cited possible electrical issues and building settling noises as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that the historical document left on David's desk described a medical conference that had taken place in that very room in 1927, a conference that ended abruptly when one of the attending physicians, Dr. Samuel Reynolds, collapsed and died of a heart attack. The document also mentioned that Dr. Reynolds had been the hospital's first pathologist and had established the original morgue in the building's basement. David Thompson continued working at Riverside General, though he avoided staying late in the administrative wing whenever possible. The old paging system was examined by technicians, who found it completely disconnected from any power source, with no explanation for how it might have produced the announcement David had heard. In the winter of 2018, hospital chaplain Maria Rodriguez was conducting her evening rounds at Mercy Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland. As an interfaith chaplain, Maria provided spiritual support to patients and families of all religious backgrounds, often during the most difficult moments of their lives. That particular December night, the hospital was experiencing typical winter admissions, with the emergency department busy and many beds occupied by patients with pneumonia and other seasonal illnesses. Maria had just finished visiting with the family of a critically ill patient in the intensive care unit when she decided to stop by the hospital's small chapel before ending her shift. The chapel was located on the ground floor, a quiet space with stained glass windows, wooden pews, and a small altar area. Maria found the chapel empty when she arrived at 9:17 p.m., though she noticed that several candles had been lit, despite her having extinguished all of them when she last visited the space that afternoon. As she moved to blow out the candles, she heard what sounded like soft weeping coming from the back corner of the chapel, though no one was visible. Maria approached the sound, calling out gently to offer assistance, but the weeping stopped as she drew closer, and she found the area empty. At 9:42 p.m., while Maria was sitting in one of the pews gathering her thoughts before leaving, she noticed what appeared to be a woman in old-fashioned nursing uniform kneeling at the altar, though the figure was somewhat translucent and difficult to see clearly. As Maria watched, the figure turned and looked directly at her. Though it had no discernible facial features, Maria, who had encountered many unusual spiritual experiences in her work, felt an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from the figure. When she blinked, the apparition was gone, though the area around the altar felt noticeably colder. The most disturbing event occurred at 10:08 p.m. as Maria was finally leaving the chapel. As she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her say, "I couldn't save them." When she turned, she saw a man in what appeared to be a doctor's coat from a previous era, standing near the chapel entrance. The figure looked solid and real, though Maria knew no one else should be in the chapel at that hour. "I tried," the figure continued, "but the fever took so many." As Maria reached out to offer comfort, the figure slowly faded away, leaving behind only the distinct smell of antiseptic and the sound of distant coughing. The official incident report, case MMC 2018-1105 Chapel, cited possible fatigue and emotional stress as the explanation for Maria's experiences, with no formal investigation launched. What the report did not mention was that hospital archives contained records of a devastating influenza outbreak in 1918 that had overwhelmed the hospital's capacity. A young doctor and several nurses had died while caring for patients during that epidemic, with the chapel serving as a temporary morgue when the hospital's regular facilities were exceeded. Maria Rodriguez continued her work at Mercy Medical Center, though she often found herself drawn to the chapel during late hours, sometimes leaving extra candles lit as a gesture of remembrance for those who had served and died in the hospital's early years. The chapel underwent renovations the following year. Though staff members continued to report occasional unexplained occurrences, candles lighting on their own, the sound of weeping when the space was empty, and the distinct feeling of being watched by unseen presences. In the summer of 2017, security guard Marcus Williams was working the night shift at Oakdale Community Hospital in rural Pennsylvania. The hospital, originally built in the 1940s, had undergone multiple expansions over the decades, resulting in a confusing layout of old and new sections connected by various corridors and additions. Marcus had been working at Oakdale for just over a year and often patrolled the less traveled areas of the facility during the quiet overnight hours. That particular July night, the hospital was operating at reduced capacity, with many staff members on vacation and patient admissions lower than usual. The first unusual incident occurred at 12:37 a.m., while Marcus was patrolling the old West Wing, which had been partially repurposed for storage, but still contained some unused patient rooms. As he passed room 137, he heard what sounded like a bed rail being lowered, though the room should have been empty and unused. When he entered to investigate, he found the bed rail indeed in the down position, though he was certain it had been up during his previous round an hour earlier. The room was otherwise undisturbed, with a thick layer of dust on most surfaces except for a clear handprint on the bed rail itself. Marcus documented the finding and continued his patrol, though he felt increasingly uneasy in the quiet, deserted wing. At 2:15 a.m., while Marcus was monitoring the security cameras in the main lobby, he noticed something peculiar on the feed from the old West Wing, a figure in what appeared to be a nurse's uniform from a previous era walking down the corridor. When Marcus rushed to investigate, he found the hallway empty, though the security footage clearly showed the figure entering room 137 and disappearing. When he reviewed the footage more closely, he noticed that the figure seemed to flicker and distort, as if the recording itself was malfunctioning, though other camera feeds showed no such issues. The most disturbing event occurred at 3:52 a.m. as Marcus was completing his final patrol of the night. As he passed room 137 again, he heard what sounded like a patient moaning in pain, followed by a woman's voice saying, "It's all right, I'm here now." When Marcus entered the room, he found it empty as before, though the bed rail was once again in the down position, and the sheet on the bed was disturbed as if someone had been lying there. As he stood there listening, he heard the voice again, this time saying clearly, "I'm sorry, I couldn't do more." followed by the distinct sound of a heart monitor flatlining, though no such equipment had been in that room for over a decade. The official incident report, Case Durchastar OCH 2170718 SEC, cited possible equipment malfunction and building noises as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that hospital archives revealed room 137 had been the site of a patient's death in 1962 under questionable circumstances. An elderly patient had died during the night while being cared for by a young nurse, who was later found to have made several medication errors. The nurse, overwhelmed by guilt in the subsequent investigation, had resigned from nursing and never returned to the hospital. Marcus Williams completed his shift, but requested a transfer to the daytime shift the following week, citing a need to change his sleep schedule. Room 137 was permanently secured and used only for storage, though security guards continued to report occasional unexplained occurrences in that area of the old West Wing. In the spring of 2019, medical records clerk Emily Watson was working the night shift at County General Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona. The medical records department was located in the hospital's basement, a climate-controlled environment of filing cabinets, computer terminals, and microfilm readers. Emily had been in this position for 6 months, having recently moved to Phoenix from the Midwest. The night shift was typically quiet, with most of Emily's work involving processing the day's patient records and preparing files for the next day's appointments. That particular April night, the department was operating with minimal staffing due to budget constraints, leaving Emily as the only clerk on duty for most of her shift. The first unusual incident occurred at 11:28 p.m. While Emily was retrieving old patient files from the deep storage area at the back of the department. As she was searching for a record from 1978, she noticed that several files had been removed from their shelves and left scattered on the floor. When she examined the files more closely, she found that they all belonged to patients who had died in the hospital, with dates of death ranging from the 1950s to the 1980s. Emily returned the files to their proper places and noted the incident in her log, assuming that perhaps a previous employee had been working on a project and left the files disorganized. At 1:43 a.m., while Emily was digitizing old paper records, she heard what sounded like a file cabinet drawer opening and closing on its own. When she went to investigate, she found that drawer 23 of cabinet 7 was indeed slightly ajar, though she was certain all cabinets had been closed and locked earlier in the evening. When she opened the drawer, she found it empty except for a single file folder with no label. Inside the folder was a single photograph, a black and white image of what appeared to be a hospital ward from the 1950s, with several nurses standing around empty beds. As Emily examined the photograph more closely, she noticed that one of the nurses appeared to be looking directly at the camera with an expression of distress. The most disturbing event occurred at 3:17 a.m. as Emily was preparing to complete her shift. As she was shutting down her computer, she heard what sounded like multiple voices whispering from the deep storage area. When she went to investigate, she found that the files she had returned to their shelves earlier were once again scattered on the floor, arranged in a rough circle around an empty space in the center. As Emily stood there in shock, she heard a voice say clearly, "We're still here," followed by the sound of all the file cabinet drawers in the storage area opening simultaneously. Emily fled the department and called security, who found the area exactly as Emily had described, though they could offer no explanation for how the drawers might have opened on their own. The official incident report, Case CGH 21904-5 MR, cited possible structural vibration and equipment malfunction as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that the photograph Emily had found matched historical images of the hospital's tuberculosis ward from the 1950s, a ward that had been located in the basement where the medical records department now stood. Many patients and several nurses had died in that ward during a particularly severe outbreak, with the ward eventually closing due to high mortality rates and the development of more effective treatments. Emily Watson completed her shift but submitted her resignation the following day, citing only a need to return to the Midwest for family reasons. The unlabeled photograph was never found again, though several employees continued to report occasional unexplained occurrences in the medical records department files moving on their own, drawers opening without explanation, and the distinct sound of coughing coming from the empty deep storage area. In the autumn of 2020, hospital pharmacist Daniel Kim was working the night shift at Westside Medical Center in Seattle, Washington. The pharmacy was located on the ground floor, a secure area of medication storage, compounding equipment, and computer terminals for order processing. Daniel had been in this position for 3 years and appreciated the precise, methodical nature of his work, reviewing prescriptions, checking for drug interactions, and preparing medications for patients throughout the hospital. That particular November night, the hospital was experiencing typical seasonal admissions, with the pharmacy processing orders for patients with respiratory infections and other common illnesses. The first unusual incident occurred at 10:47 p.m., while Daniel was preparing IV medications for the intensive care unit. As he was working in the sterile compounding area, he heard what sounded like someone counting pills in the main pharmacy area, though he knew he was alone in the department. When he went to investigate, he found that several medication bottles had been removed from their shelves and left on the counter, though no one else had entered the secure pharmacy area. Daniel reviewed the security footage, which showed no one entering or leaving the pharmacy except himself, though the camera did briefly flicker at 10:43 p.m., exactly when he had first heard the counting sound. At 12:32 a.m., while Daniel was processing medication orders for the various hospital units, he noticed something peculiar on his computer screen. An order for a medication that hadn't been used in decades, a drug called hexamethonium that had been discontinued due to serious side effects. The order was for a patient in room 402, though Daniel knew that room was currently used for storage and had no patients. When he tried to delete the unusual order, it kept reappearing on his screen, each time with a note that said, "Patient needs this to breathe properly." The most disturbing event occurred at 2:19 a.m., as Daniel was conducting his routine inventory check, as he was counting the controlled substances in the locked cabinet. He heard what sounded like someone whispering medication dosages from behind him. When he turned, he saw what appeared to be a figure in an old-fashioned pharmacist's coat standing near the compounding area, though the figure was somewhat translucent and difficult to see clearly. "1 grain of digitalis," the figure said, "not 2. That's what killed her." As Daniel watched in shock, the figure slowly faded away, leaving behind only the distinct smell of old medications and the sound of a pill bottle being placed on a counter. The official incident report, Case WMC 2001 Neurasma 2 Farm, cited possible computer system glitch and auditory hallucination due to fatigue as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that hospital archives contained records of a medication error in 1952 that had resulted in a patient's death. A pharmacist had accidentally prepared a dose of digitalis that was twice the prescribed amount, leading to the patient's fatal overdose. The pharmacist, overwhelmed by guilt, had resigned shortly after the incident and was never heard from again. Daniel Kim completed his shift, but requested a transfer to the outpatient pharmacy the following week, telling his supervisor only that he preferred working during daytime hours. The computer system was checked by IT specialists, who found no explanation for the mysterious medication order that had appeared on Daniel's screen. In the winter of 2018, maintenance worker Carlos Rodriguez was working the night shift at St. Joseph's Hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana. The hospital, originally built in the 1920s, had undergone multiple renovations over the decades, resulting in a complex infrastructure of old and new systems. Carlos had been working at St. Joseph's for 5 years and was responsible for addressing maintenance issues throughout the facility during the quiet overnight hours. That particular December night, the hospital was experiencing typical winter admissions, with the heating system working overtime to combat the unusual cold spell that had descended upon the city. The first unusual incident occurred at 11:15 p.m., while Carlos was checking the HVAC system in the old south wing, which had been partially converted to office space, but still contained some unused patient rooms. As he was examining the ventilation ducts in the ceiling of room 205, he heard what sounded like a bed being wheeled down the hallway, though the wing was supposed to be empty of patients and medical equipment. When he went to investigate, he found the hallway empty, though he did notice that the door to room 207 was slightly ajar, though he was certain all doors in that wing had been closed and locked during his previous round. At 1:28 a.m., while Carlos was repairing a leaky pipe in the basement of the old wing, he heard what sounded like multiple people talking and moving around in the hallway above him. When he went to investigate, he found the area empty and quiet, though he did notice that several light bulbs had been unscrewed from their sockets, leaving the corridor in partial darkness. As Carlos was replacing the bulbs, he heard what sounded like a gurney being pushed past him, though no one was visible in the corridor. When he examined the floor more closely, he found fresh tracks in the dust, as if something heavy had recently been wheeled through the area. The most disturbing event occurred at 3:42 a.m., as Carlos was completing his final inspection of the old wing before ending his shift. As he passed room 205 again, he noticed that the door was now open and the light was on, though he was certain he had turned it off earlier. When he entered the room, he found that the bed, which should have been removed years ago when the wing was converted to office space, was now in the center of the room with sheets and blankets arranged as if a patient were lying there. As Carlos stood there in shock, he heard a voice say, "I can't breathe," followed by the sound of a respiratory machine alarm, though no such equipment had been in that room for over a decade. The official incident report, case SJH 2018-1207 Mayent, cited possible electrical issues and building settling noises as the explanation for the events. What the report did not mention was that hospital archives revealed room 205 had been the site of a patient's death in 1965 during a power outage that had disabled the patient's respiratory equipment. The patient, a young man with polio, had suffocated when the backup generator failed to engage during a severe storm that had cut power to the hospital for several hours. Carlos Rodriguez completed his shift, but requested a transfer to the daytime maintenance crew the following week, citing a need to change his work schedule. Room 205 was permanently secured and used only for storage, though maintenance workers continued to report occasional unexplained occurrences in that area of the old South Wing. The American hospital remains a place of healing and hope, yet it also stands as a repository of human stories, some ending in recovery, others in passage. These accounts from medical professionals across the country remind us that hospitals occupy a unique space between life and death, a threshold where the boundaries sometimes grow thin. The witnesses we've heard from tonight are trained observers, people accustomed to rational explanations and scientific methodology. Yet each found themselves confronted with phenomena that defied their training and challenged their understanding of the world. What connects these disparate experiences is not proof of the supernatural, but rather the persistence of human stories that refuse to be contained by conventional explanations. The nurse who heard voices in empty rooms, the technician who saw impossible images on medical equipment, the chaplain who encountered figures from the hospital's past, each carries with them the memory of something that cannot be easily categorized or dismissed. These stories linger not because they provide answers, but because they remind us of the mysteries that still exist in the most clinical of environments. The hospital environment, with its constant cycles of life and death, its 24-hour operations, its history stretching back decades or even centuries, creates a unique backdrop for such encounters. Each facility holds within its walls the accumulated experiences of countless patients and staff members. Their emotions and energies perhaps leaving an imprint that occasionally becomes visible to those working during the quiet hours when the normal rhythms of the hospital are temporarily suspended. If you or someone you know has a true story to share about unexplained experiences in medical settings, leave it in the comments below. These accounts, when documented and shared, become part of a larger tapestry of human experience that transcends individual belief systems. Whether one interprets these events as supernatural, psychological, or simply unexplained, they serve as a reminder that even in our most scientific and rational environments, there remain phenomena that elude easy categorization. Thank you for watching Snowbound Screams. Until next time, stay safe out there.